Thank you so much for inviting me today. I was here in the spring and I appreciated the conversation and meeting people so much that I was quick to say yes when I was invited here again this fall. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on some of the ways anti-Muslim racism has been and continues to be manifested, exploring the broader context, particularly given the moment we're in, and considering strategies for moving forward. And I very much look forward to the discussion after my remarks. I speak to you from my perspective as a white Jewish American partner in this work, as someone concerned with Islamophobia and also concerned with the ways the communities I'm part of perpetuate and or respond to Islamophobia. And I'm one of multiple voices speaking out on this issue. We can see all around us that anti-Muslim racism has become deeply entrenched within U.S. society. We see it on the streets, in our government, in our institutions, in the media, really in the air we breathe. At the same time, there's very strong organizing spearheaded by Muslim communities challenging Islamophobia, white supremacy, and racist violence. The groups I'm part of and many other organizations engage as partners in this organizing as we make clear the demand for dignity and for full human and civil rights for Muslim communities and for all communities. Islamophobia is a form of racism. A group of scholars and activists who developed a syllabus called Islamophobia is Racism understand Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism, which in their words, and I quote, more accurately reflects the intersection of race and religion as a reality of structural inequality and violence rooted in the longer history of U.S. and European empire building, unquote. Also, as anthropologist, activist, and organizer Donna A. Austin points out, a third of the Muslim community, which is black, quote, exists right at the intersection of these two forms of racism, that is, anti-black racism and anti-Muslim racism. While 9/11 marked a critical change in the treatment of Muslims in the U.S., and while Islamophobia has continued to intensify in so many ways in recent months and years, Islamophobia, in fact, existed way before 9/11. Professor Edward E. Curtis IV explains that, quote, African Americans do not fit neatly into post-9/11 anti-Muslim narratives, unquote. Black Muslims born in the United States have been shaped by their experiences in this country, including enslavement, white supremacy, and pre-9/11 government surveillance. In the half-century before 9/11, numerous, quote, anti-terrorism laws, policies, and actions targeted Muslims and Arabs who were commonly conflated with Muslims. I want to just give one example as articulated by scholar, artist, activist Suad Abdul Kabir, and I quote, profiling black Muslim groups is absolutely nothing new. Black Muslims have been monitored by the U.S. government since the 1930s. The Nation of Islam was a particular target of J. Edgar Hoover's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, established in the 1950s during the height of the Cold War, unquote. And she continues to describe the way COINTELPRO had as its goal targeting and destroying groups like the Nation of Islam and others that the FBI deemed a threat to national security. Martin Luther King Jr. was on their list, as was Muhammad Ali. So this is just one of many examples of Islamophobia before 9/11. I'd now like to look at 9/11 and beyond. During this period, there's been an onslaught of government surveillance, detentions, deportations, and ongoing violence. At the same time, the U.S. has engaged in a seemingly endless, quote, global war on terror that has helped legitimize racism against the, quote, terrorist enemy at home and abroad. The U.S. government and many others consider ongoing civil liberties violations and the invasions and drone attacks and other violence it directs toward Muslim-majority countries as legitimate post-9/11 responses. In Violence Comes Home, an interview with Arun Kundnani, he says, quote, the promise of the war on terror was that we would kill them over there so they would not kill us over here. Hence, mass violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Palestine, Yemen, and Somalia in the name of peace in the West. The authorization to use military force that the U.S. Congress passed in the days after 9/11 already defined the whole world as a battlefield in the war on terror, unquote. The hatred behind the global and domestic war on terror has led to policies like the Muslim ban, whose impact has been devastating. On June 26th of this year, the Supreme Court upheld the Trump administration's third Muslim ban. As a result, the United States currently bans nationals of 5 Muslim-majority countries: Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and a small number of North Koreans and Venezuelans from coming to the country on most or all types of visas, even if they have spouses, children, parents, or other family members who are citizens or permanent residents of the United States. More than a year after the Muslim ban's introduction, thousands of children, parents, and spouses remain separated as a result of visa denials. The Supreme Court ruling may make those separations permanent. So who are some of the Islamophobes who are putting forth misinformation and spearheading many of the Islamophobic campaigns and policies we've seen in recent years, and who are increasingly in intergovernment circles? I'd like to talk briefly about what's been identified as the Islamophobic network in America. Through extensive research, the Center for American Progress, CAP, has revealed that there is a, quote, small, tightly networked group of misinformation experts guiding an effort that reaches millions of Americans through partners in the media, strong advocates, increasingly strong links to the government and various mainstream institutions, and organizing on the ground. In our research, my colleague Ellie Bolkin and I documented the ways in which those who fund the Islamophobic network are also funding right-wing Israeli projects. The funders and groups they support overlap in significant ways. They further a rabid anti-Muslim climate, and its members bolster state-sponsored Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian policies of the U.S. government. People and organizations who are identified as part of this Islamophobic network in America, Islamophobia network in America, have ideological or personal links to key government officials, including those who are part of the current administration. Let's look, for instance, at Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton. When Pompeo was being considered for the position he now holds, the Senate raised the issue of his close connections with Bridget Gabriel, a key Islamophobe from Act for America, who maintains that a, quote, practicing Muslim who believes in the teachings of the Quran cannot be a loyal citizen of the United States. The Southern Poverty Law Center describes ACT as the largest grassroots anti-Muslim group in America. A main ACT priority is to support state legislation against Sharia law, which is overwhelmingly concerned with personal religious observance such as prayer and fasting. The ACLU has described Sharia law as the, quote, mythical threat to the U.S. law. As a member of Congress, Pompeo delivered speeches at ACT conferences, arranged for a presentation at the Capitol, and accepted ACT's highest award. Like Pompeo, John Bolton has connections with a number of prominent anti-Muslim ideologues, including Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy, a leading Muslim disinformation expert. Viewing mosques as quote, Trojan horses that Muslims use to promote, quote, sedition, and Islam as a totalitarian ideology, not a religion, Gaffney has worked with ACT to advance anti-Sharia law in many state legislatures. In Florida, right where we all are, Former congressional representative and current Republican candidate for governor Ron DeSantis has described himself as a, quote, an admirer of David Horowitz, a leading anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim activist since the late 1980s. The David Horowitz Freedom Center puts out Front Page Magazine, a major online purveyor of anti-Muslim conspiracy theories. The Southern Poverty Law Center has described Horowitz as the godfather of the modern anti-Muslim movement. In 2015, DeSantis said, according to a Washington Post report, that the David Horowitz Freedom Center was telling, quote, the American people the truth and standing up for the right thing, unquote. So I'd like to move away from the Islamophobes in or near the White House and U.S. government, as awful as they are, and turn our attention to liberal Islamophobia. While we need to organize against the virulent Islamophobia and racism that's reflected by the policies of the current administration, we must also analyze and challenge the kind of Islamophobia known as liberal Islamophobia that opposes Islamophobia on one hand and supports policies and programs that target Muslims and those perceived to be Muslims on the other hand. Liberal Islamophobia, like all forms of Islamophobia, is extensive. I believe that those of us who consider ourselves progressive and want to be principal partners in challenging Islamophobia need to be self-reflective in the way that we may be unwittingly promoting or even perpetuating Islamophobia. Quote, at the end of the day, writes scholar and activist Deepa Kumar, whose work I admire deeply, liberal imperialists, for all their talk of speaking softly, accept the logic that the U.S. can and should intervene anywhere it wants to around the world to pursue its interests with no respect whatsoever for the right of self-determination of the people in the countries it targets. Liberal Islamophobia is still racist at its core, unquote. So there are many examples of liberal Islamophobia. One example is the notion put forth often by people who identify as liberal or progressive that Muslim women are victims or are oppressed in need of, quote, saving or rescuing from a uniquely sexist religion and culture. This is consistent with this notion of the U.S. needing to bring freedom to backward countries. In actuality, these views have been repackaged repeatedly to justify colonialism and occupation. And as Sunaina Mehra writes, it is yet, quote, another case of white men and white women trying to save brown women from brown men, unquote. One can't overstate the extent of this othering or caricaturing of Muslim women in both mainstream and liberal Islamophobic discourse that ignores or distorts the breadth and depth of their lived experience, voice, and analysis. Among others, the powerful work of Darakshan Raja, co-director of the Justice for Muslim Collective, delves deeply into issues of gendered Islamophobia. Liberal Islamophobia also manifests itself in other ways. A common framing is to divide Muslims into two categories: those who are considered to be good Muslims and those who are considered to be bad Muslims. Introduced by Mahmoud Mamdani, the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm results on the premise that after 9/11, quote, unless proved to be good, every Muslim is presumed to be bad, unquote. All Muslims are now under an obligation to prove their credentials by joining in a war against, quote, bad Muslims. So Islamophobic assumptions are clearly at the heart of the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm. And this assumption extends to Arabs, who are often all conflated with being Muslim, and to all those who are perceived to be Arab, Middle Eastern, or Muslim, such as South Asians. So operating from this framework of the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, Many Jewish and other groups will only work with Muslim or Arab American groups that do not or agree not to publicly criticize Israeli policies or work with any groups that are considered pro-Palestine. And they insist that these Muslim or Arab American groups explicitly and publicly denounce anti-Semitism. But it's criteria that Christian groups, for example, who are potential partners, are never asked to meet. So the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm attempts to control which Muslim and Arab Americans are suitable to work with while discrediting all others. And this kind of scrutiny is based on lies and half-truths and distortions that are put forth by those who are promoting Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. So the commitment that often gets expressed of working in partnerships with Muslim groups is too easily compromised by the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, which makes it impossible to engage in work together that is rooted in true respect and dignity. So how do those of us who are partners in this work, in my case as members of Jewish organizations, play a meaningful role in the broader movement and as part of our communities? While, as I mentioned earlier, Islamophobia has a long and ugly pre-9/11 history, I think for many of us from outside the Muslim community, our activism and awareness about Islamophobia and how it manifests itself is much more recent. My involvement began many years ago when a Muslim principal of an Arabic language, dual language public school in New York City lost her position because of a sustained Islamophobic campaign directly related to Israel politics that brought this issue to my attention. I had never seen or understood the many dimensions of Islamophobia so starkly as I did with this campaign. And while the rabid Islamophobes did their damage, the real damage was done by the mayor's office of New York City and the Department of Education, government institutions that capitulated to the demands of the anti-Muslim ideologues who demanded the principal's resignation. Similarly, in New York City, it was the Islamophobes who stirred up fears of Muslims in New York, but it was the mayor who endorsed police surveillance of the city's entire Muslim community. So again, this points to the importance of challenging state-sponsored Islamophobia. Those of us who are partners in challenging Islamophobia join together with the significant organizing taking place inspired by the leadership of those most impacted by its injustices. We are seeing more and more organizing happening across communities, responding to the Muslim bans, to increased deportations of immigrant communities, to misogyny and sexual violence, and to the anti-black racism and militarization of police that threaten the lives and safety of so many communities. This work is increasingly intersecting in the deepest ways that strengthen distinct yet overlapping struggles for justice. So as many of us in Jewish communities engage in challenging Islamophobia, a number of principles help guide and frame our analyses and our work. One, we want to be as visible as we can in our opposition to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, particularly within our own communities. Our goal is to stand together with Muslim communities and all those impacted by Islamophobia. Two, as we recognize the seriousness of individual acts of Islamophobia, and they are increasing in frightening ways, we also want to stress the damage and extent of structural and state-sponsored Islamophobia fueled by the, quote, war on terror, which often doesn't get addressed in the broader society. A number of groups focus on this work. I'd like to specifically mention the work of the Justice for Muslims Collective in Washington, D.C., that intentionally and powerfully forefronts state-sanctioned Islamophobia and the impact of the, quote, war on terror on Muslim communities. So while we must oppose hate crimes against Muslims and do it vigorously, We must equally vigorously oppose state-sponsored surveillance of the Muslim community or U.S. policies that result in death and destruction in predominantly Muslim communities across the globe. 3, we believe that understanding the connections among Israeli Islamophobia, Israel politics, and U.S. foreign policy are critical to any analysis of how anti-Muslim racism works and flourishes, and to the organizing that grows out of that analysis. And 4, we understand that our work to challenge Islamophobia is part of the broader movement for justice and integrity for all communities. We also engage in community education. We think that should be an integral part of our work, and it is, so that our organizing can really be as principled and as effective as possible. So we created and we continue to create curricula and resources on many different aspects of anti-Muslim racism and on ways we can organize within our own communities and as part of the broader movement for justice. And if you look at the Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism website, jaamr.com, it's divided into lots of different areas so that we can all, instead of just going out there and saying things that we really understand what we're saying, and we are able to communicate effectively and really share with other people in meaningful ways and engage together so that we can all, because we're all in this together, we're all learning together. And many of us, myself included, have had unlearning to do as well. So, in addition to the community education, which is ongoing, the organizing takes many different forms. These include, for example, we have outdoor events during Jewish holidays that exhibit a public commitment to challenging Islamophobia and to standing and joining with Muslims and other communities to fight for justice. We hold educational events in public forums. We protest Islamophobes who come to town. We put up posters in neighborhoods that say refugees and immigrants are welcome here, and stop profiling Muslims, and standing with Muslims against Islamophobia and racism. In addition to having great visibility and making clear that our neighborhoods are safe for everyone, this postering campaign has led to lots of meaningful conversations and community building in different neighborhoods across the country, and we have done it with groups together in the South Florida area as well. So, as we all know, we're in a period right now where the vitriol is everywhere, and where white supremacists, including those with the power of the state behind them, feel emboldened to make visible and enact however they can their violent and aggressive combination of racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, transphobia, homophobia, and more. So as we engage, and as I'm work together with groups who are part of Jewish communities in our work to challenge Islamophobia, we pledge to continue to oppose anti-Muslim racism in all its forms and manifestations from our different identities and locations from within our communities, to challenge Islamophobic framings that falsely equate Islam and Muslims and Arabs with violence, recentering the conversation of violence where it belongs, on the ongoing, pervasive violence of imperialism and occupation, and to be ethical, consistent, generous, and responsible partners in all we do. Thank you.